Okay, welcome back to Criminology 4332. What is theories of criminal behavior? And now we're going to get into the content of the course. And as indicated on the syllabus, we're going to talk about what is theory and why we study theory. What is theory and why study theory? And I'm going to give you the definition of a theory, just the general definition, and then we are going to point by point take that definition and apply it to criminal behavior, which is what we'll be talking about this semester. So here you go. And get this very carefully, and I'm going to give you 4 words to underline. But here's the definition, the general definition of a theory, no matter if it's a theory in chemistry, physics, biology, sociology, political science, no matter economics, no matter what the discipline, here's the definition of a theory. A theory is a set, and you know that you'll be looking at this on your first quiz. I'm telling you what right now. A theory is a set of interrelated propositions that are an attempt to do 4 things now. Describe, explain, predict, and control some phenomenon, in our case, crime. So once again, the definition of a theory, it is a set of interrelated propositions that are an attempt to describe, explain, predict, and control some phenomenon. That's the definition of a theory. Now let's take that definition and apply it to criminal behavior and zero in on exactly what we'll be talking about during the course of this semester, during the course of these 15 modules. Okay? And I'm going to tell you, first of all, underline those 4 words: describe, explain, predict, and control. Now I'm going to go discuss each of those 4 words and apply them specifically to what we'll be talking about in here. First of all, a theorist has to describe what he's talking about, what he's theorizing about. And that's true of criminologists. You know, criminal behavior is a big arena. White-collar crime, organized crime, street crime, juvenile crime. You know, there's some things that are crimes for juveniles that aren't crimes for adults. Running away, truancy, stuff like that. So what are we talking about? Crimes against person, crimes against property. I mean, criminal behavior is a big, big arena. So we need to focus in on what we are talking about. Misdemeanors, felonies, you know, jaywalking is a crime. So we need to focus in, we need to describe here what we're talking about. So let's talk about describe. And I'm going to say some things here by way of helping us understand it. We are a society or a nation of rules and regulations, laws, customs. Think about it. From the time you get up in the morning until the time you go to bed at night, you are almost constantly complying with or violating rules, regulations, laws, customs, expectations. That's what human behavior is. And some of these rules and regulations are very formal and some are informal. I want you to do this now. In your notebook or on a piece of scratch paper, other piece of paper, notebook paper, draw a line, a continuum, a straight horizontal line. And on the left side of that line, put the word informal, and on the right-hand side, formal. And then there's everything in between. You know, some of our laws and regulations and customs are very informal, some of them unwritten. Others are much more formal. The criminal code, for example, is very, very formal. And everything in between. Some things are more or less formal, more or less informal. But keep that right in front of you, okay? So on the informal side, I would say, and I wish we were in the classroom, but I would say things like rules of etiquette, of grooming, of proper manners, things like that. Those are not in any code or, the criminal code. We just know that when we eat at somebody's home, we don't let the food run down our chin. We don't belch at the table. Those are rules of etiquette. We shower once in a while. We don't walk around smelly. I've had a few people in the office where I felt like I had to fumigate the place afterwards. But manners, that's informal stuff. It's not even written down for the most part. Or if you go into a classroom, you don't, there are unwritten rules of how you dress. You don't go in there in a tuxedo or an evening gown, for God's sake, or a Speedo. You dress like this, pretty much. On the other hand, on the other side of your continuum, or on the other side of your horizontal line, you got very formal rules and regulations, the criminal code. You go into a law office, you go into the library of a lawyer's office, or you go down to the courthouse, in the law office there, shelf after shelf, where criminal behavior is defined in minute detail, exactly what we're talking about. First degree murder, second degree murder, manslaughter, and minute pages and pages describing exactly what that is. And it's very, very formal. And I think we protect the things that we value most highly with very, very formal rules and regulations. And again, I wish we were in a classroom, but I'm going to suggest to you that what we value most highly in our society is human life and personal property. If you kill, formal criminal laws address the killing of people, the assaulting of people, the hurting of people, the injuring of people. Human life, it's sacred to us. And personal property. You don't take somebody else's stuff. You don't damage it. Personal property. That also is sacrosanct. Not in all societies, but in ours it is. So I suggest that on the far right-hand side of your continuum, you have you have laws that protect human life and personal property. On the other side of the continuum, as we move to the left, those are things that we value, but not as highly. Table etiquette, classroom etiquette, proper grooming. Yeah, they're important, but they're not as important as human life, personal property. And we protect those things with more informal, often unwritten rules and regulations and customs. Sometimes something is just a custom. It's something people come to understand without ever reading about it or writing about it. Things that are in handbooks, orientation sessions, things like that. The syllabus that you have. That's an example. You need to follow the syllabus to get through this course. But that syllabus is not nearly as important as laws proscribing murder. But the syllabus is an example. Syllabus is an example. What I just went through with you in the earlier video. These are the rules and regulations that you and I will follow as together we go through this course this semester, these 15 modules. And let's move on to, so some rules are formal, some are informal, and then we have everything in between. A rule is not really worth anything unless there's a consequence to be paid for somebody who violates it. Punishment. You can say this is the rule here, but it's empty, it's meaningless, unless there's a consequence to be paid by somebody who violates that rule. And with respect to the more formal rules, our criminal code, for example, our criminal laws, The punishments are severe: imprisonment, death, probation, which is not as severe as imprisonment, but it's a form of punishment. Treatment as well, but also punishment. On the other hand, on the other end of your continuum, on the informal side, the punishments are much less severe. If you don't shower and you walk around smelling and offending people, you're not going to prison. You're not going to receive a lethal injection. You're not going to be placed on probation. You're not going to be prosecuted. But you're probably going to be avoided. People are going to avoid you. If you drool and belch and act crudely at somebody's home for dinner, you're probably not going to be invited in. If you show up for class in that tuxedo, I'm being extreme here for purposes of explanation, or that evening gown, you're not going to be prosecuted, but people are probably going to, that guy's a little weird, stay away from him. So the punishments are much less severe on the informal side, okay? So we have rules, formal, informal, punishments. Severe, much less severe, okay? If you don't comply with this syllabus and you don't do well in this course, you'll fail or get a passing grade, but a very poor passing grade, something that won't do wonders for your GPA. But you're not going to prison. It's informal. On the other hand, if you walk out of here and assault somebody, yeah, you're going to be prosecuted and maybe go to jail or prison or placed on probation. That's a much more serious, that's much more formal regulation. And it's the punishments for violating that regulation are much more severe. Okay? Now let's talk about another aspect of these rules and regulations that we have. They all vary by time. I'm going to give you 3 elements of variation: time and place and circumstance. First of all, time. All of these rules and regulations, they vary by time, even the more serious ones. For example, on January 23rd of 1973, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Roe versus Wade, legalizing abortion. On January 22nd, abortion was a felony. On January 23rd, it's health care. A variation by time. If we were in the classroom, we could have a good discussion about, hey, what are some things that didn't used to be criminal and now they are? Or used to be criminal and now they're not. I'm looking at my notes here. A much more an informal example: smoking. When I was where you are, the desks in the classroom, when I was in college, the desks in the classroom had ashtrays for students who wanted to smoke in class. And I can recall professors going through 2 or 3 cigarettes in the course of delivering a class that day, a lecture. Now, you can't smoke any place in this building, on this campus. You can't. And you're not going to go to prison if you do, but there are ordinances. You may be fined, depending upon where you are. Smoking is looked upon much differently than it used to be. It's still regulated informally, but we're getting more and more formal in terms of how we regulate it. What about things that used to be homosexuality? When I was where you are, you could go to prison for something like sodomy, anal intercourse between 2 men. It was a felony. Then it got to be a mental disorder. Now it's an alternative lifestyle. And if you've got a problem with it, there's something wrong with you. But not that long ago, when I was in college, it was a felony. and people did time in prison for it. Okay, um, I'm thinking of some other things. Well, you could think of some other examples too. I don't want to kick a dead horse here. I just or a dead dog, whatever you kick. But those are some examples. So these rules vary by time, and as you go from right to left on that continuum that you put together, there's more and more variation. Informal regulations and rules and customs, there's much more variation by time than there is with the more formal stuff. You know, I can't recall a time when murder was not illegal, when larceny was not illegal. It's always been wrong, and always will be. I'd be shocked in the future if anybody mounted an initiative to legalize murder. The more formal rules and regulations simply do not vary by time nearly as much. Some do. I gave you the example of Roe versus Wade. But that kind of variation is much more common with the informal rules and regulations. How about place? Variation by place. You know, gambling, prostitution, recreational marijuana, same-sex marriage. And same-sex marriage is recognized as a legal status in some states, not in others. Recreational marijuana, okay in some places. The manufacture, distribution, and use of marijuana for recreational purposes is okay in Washington State, in Colorado, in other states now as well. But in other states, it's a felony. So you go up to Washington State, and the use of recreational marijuana is okay in Washington. You step 2 feet across the line in Idaho, and it's a felony. Variation by place. Prostitution, legal in Nevada. A felony in all the other 49 states. And even in Nevada, there are 2 counties. Clark County, which is Las Vegas, and Washoe County, which is Reno. It's illegal in those 2 counties, but it's legal, entirely legal in all the other counties in Nevada. Variation by place. And that variation, again, just like the variation by time, is much more common the more informal the regulations are. The more formal they are, the less variation by time, by place there is. But there is some variation. I just gave you the example of prostitution or marijuana. But, you know, as far as things like murder and larceny and manslaughter, those things they're not legal any place. So there's more variation by place, just like there is by time, as you go from right to left on that continuum of yours, from formal to informal. Circumstance. There are some circumstances where there's variation as well. More so with the informal regulations than there are with formal. But how about an example? What about a woman who murders her husband? She's convicted of first-degree murder. But so that she's convicted in the first phase of her trial. Then we move on to the sentencing phase. And I'm her attorney, I'm going to present to that jury all kinds of mitigating circumstances. Mitigating means that these are circumstances which make an act less serious, less offensive than it might have been otherwise, as opposed to aggravating circumstances which make it more egregious. I'm going to point out to the jury that, yes, she killed her husband. We're not debating that. She murdered her husband. After 20 years of physical and psychological abuse. How many of you ladies on this jury wouldn't do the same thing? So I'm presenting to the jury mitigating circumstances. Prosecution, on the other hand, is going to present aggravating circumstances. No. She planned this thing, had this thing in mind for months, and finally did it. So this was planned. There's nothing mitigating here at all. So I'm the defense attorney. I'm asking the jury to give her probation. Don't send her to prison. You do the same thing. Prosecutor, send her to prison. This is planned, premeditated, aggravating circumstances. So anyway, and again, the circumstantial part of this is much more common with informal regulations than it is with formal regulations. I'm trying to think of some examples of informal of circumstances involving informal rules and regulations. Like, I can't think of any right offhand. I wish we were in a classroom. You could help me out here. Okay. But again, as far as variations by time, place, and circumstance, much more common. The variation is much more common on the informal side of that continuum of yours than it is on the formal side. Okay. So in this class, back to that word describe, we are going to focus on theories and theorists who have attempted to explain the causes of behavior that is regulated by formal rules and regulations. Behavior on the far right of that continuum. In here, we're not going to talk about theories as to why people jaywalk or why people smoke where they're not supposed to. We're going to be talking about theories of why people violate the criminal code. These very, very formally defined behaviors: murder, rape, assault, manslaughter, things like this. So we're not going to be talking about theories of jaywalking or stuff like that, or there's some really interesting stuff, usually written by sociologists, as to why people don't conform in some of these very informally defined areas. Fascinating stuff. Having to do with pool hustling, cross-dressing, all kinds of stuff. But in this class, in Criminology 4332, we're not going to be talking about theories that attempt to explain why people do those things, why people violate informal rules and regulations and customs. We're going to be talking about theories that explain why people commit acts that are in violations of our most formally defined rules and regulations. Why people do really serious, egregious stuff. That's what we're going to be talking about in here. Okay? So we're going to be focusing to bring this, to relate this to your continuum that you've just drawn out there. We're going to be on the far right-hand side of that continuum. So you might draw a circle or dotted line around the right-hand part of that, the right-hand section of that continuum. We're going to be talking about behavior that threatens things that we value most highly: human life, personal property. We're going to be talking about theories developed by people to explain why people commit behaviors that threaten those things that we value most highly. Why people commit felonies, serious felonies, crimes against persons and property. And we're going to be talking about behavior that simply doesn't, the rules and regulations governing that behavior simply doesn't vary much by time and place and circumstance. Pretty much everybody at all times, in all places, in all circumstances, define these things that we'll be talking about as serious crimes, as violations of formally defined rules and regulations. Behavior that should draw very, very severe punishments. That's what we'll be talking about in here. Behavior which is punished severely and which everybody agrees, almost everybody, is wrong, seriously wrong, egregiously wrong. Okay? So that's description, that's describe. The next word is explain. I'm not going to spend any time on that because theorists there try to explain what they have just described. So in here, we'll spend a whole semester talking about theorists who have attempted to explain the kind of behavior that I've just described for you. So explain, the word explain, that's our semester. So I'm not going to say anything about it now. We will spend our entire semester talking about that, discussing what has been formulated down through the years as explanations as to why people do this stuff, why people commit really serious criminal behavior. I think all theorists, I'm going to move on to the next two words right now. I think all theorists basically describe and explain. Some go beyond that and attempt to predict and control. So I think what I'd like to do is, I think I'm going to break right here. We've talked about describe and explain. All theorists do that. They describe something and then try to, like serious criminal behavior, and then try to explain why people commit that behavior. But some theorists go beyond that and get into predicting and controlling. In other words, they roll up their sleeves and get involved in the dirty business of politics and policy development and lawmaking and stuff like that. I'd like to take a break right here, and when I come back, we'll talk about predicting and controlling, and then we'll move on to conclude by talking about why it's important to study criminal behavior. Why do we make this course a requirement for our criminology majors? Anyway, so let's take a break now, and I'll be back in a few minutes with the third video segment in this module, in Module 1. We'll talk about, again, those things. I'll see you in a few minutes.